which is so very close to our hearts. We've got people who are social activists, we've got people from NGOs, we've got academics. So the right kind of thinking people, I think, who are required to address our concerns regarding negotiating gender, space, and violence, and what the lockdown means for rights and freedoms. I won't deny that it's a topic that is very, very close to my heart. And of course, I would leave it to the experts to speak about it, but very briefly, the Department of HDFE in Janki Devi Memorial College and the WDC of Janki Devi Memorial College are constantly addressing and engaging with questions related to the differences and the inequalities that exist even between women. And we've got to keep in mind that women come from different backgrounds. We've got urban women, we've got rural women, upper class, lower class women, and the power structures inside the homes of such women therefore vary according to the kind of background you come from. For example, if you belong to, say, a rural background or the lower class background, there is the whole issue of permissions that are then applied to women, even within the domestic setup. And the moment a woman is told that you've got to take permission for something, it's obviously going to lead to a very volatile setup. I mean, which human being is going to respond positively to the whole idea of taking permissions for basic rights, something as simple as answering a phone call, for example. So I've often wondered how people who belong to such backgrounds negotiate in these spaces. But it's not just restricted to rural background or migrant class or lower class women. It's also women in upper class, middle class homes who often have to hear some very bitter things like, now that you're at home, you're free, you don't have to do anything at all. And I remember watching this wonderful film by Nandita Das, which kind of addressed this issue where she was really taken for granted by various people in her home. So it would be wonderful really today to hear from all of you as to how women need to negotiate within these spaces, which then turn so violent, both verbally as well as physically, and completely undignify women very often. Thank you so much, Sequin, for collaborating with Janki Devi Memorial College. Thank you.
I'd like to ask the chairperson, Ms. Sequin, to also welcome our guests here today.
Thank you, Dia. Thank you so much to all of you for being here. Thank you to Janki Devi Memorial College, of course, for partnering with Sequin in this initiative. This is the second webinar that we are hosting this week. And we were really very pleased actually with how the first one went and the kind of interest that there's been. Even today, where the topic is, let's say, almost more academic rather than the first one, which was very, everyone's talking about coronavirus, and so a more newsy current affairs webinar. But despite that, the interest that we've had today has been fantastic. And I think that's due to the panel that we have. Everybody has seen that we have such wonderful speakers that they wanted to come in and listen to what everyone has to say. I'm going to stop myself from introducing anybody. I did last time because it was just so exciting and such a thrill to have the kind of panel that we did. And I got a bit of a rap on my knuckles by our wonderful interns, kind of reminding me very politely that this was their webinar and this was their job and not mine, which was absolutely right, and I think that's something that at Sequin, we're actually really proud of the fact that our interns do this, that they come up and they say, well, actually, this is our webinar, we're organizing it, and so you can have your 2 minutes, but then it's ours. And that ownership, actually, I was so pleased that they do see it as their property. It is. And in fact, since we started Sequin in 2009, we've had about 900 Sequin and done internships ranging from we've of course, but even university students who have come to us from abroad, some of them to the community, but they were very keen to come, and they worked in the office, and we had such amazing reports that some of these young adults have written. And so I do feel that it's a very important space when we talk about engaging the youth. It's something that I've seen at Sequin, that it's very much a two-way street. It is not just that interns come into Sequin and Sequin somehow gets, I mean, what is a diplomatic way of putting it? Free labor, let's say. It's actually something where our interns are very invested in what they do. They come to us with ideas happen. Unfortunately, I have over the years had my daughter, in order to get into university in America or something, needs this community service, I think it's called, certificate. And could you please give me the certificate and things like that. She won't be able to come because, you know, the amount of studies that she has to do, CBSE, this and that and the other. So please give the certificate. And it's so sad because they are completely missing the point. And I have to tell them that, you know, it's not just about that piece of paper. When your son or your daughter comes to us in Jamia or in Mewat and is in the center and goes out into the community and meets people, the kind of growth that you are going to see in them, the empathy that they have, the compassion that they have, the understanding that they have of what people go through is not something that they're going to learn even if they go to Stanford or Yale. So it's a real shame. You're actually really reducing your child down to just sitting with their books. And really a big congratulations to the interns who have specifically worked on these webinars, and to all of those who have generally joined hands with Sequin, because I do see how they flourish. And we certainly flourish because of that, because they come in with a whole new way of looking at things, with a very fresh perspective, and it adds that freshness to our work. So for all of those who maybe have not interned so far, who are listening to this webinar, this is just my chance, rather than telling you about the topic, because we have all the experts who are going to talk about it. It's something that I would like to just put out there to all of you, that do consider it. I think it's something that you will find extremely enriching, and it'll be something that kind of time, effort that you could put into it, I don't think you can gain that sort of experience, knowledge, understanding anywhere else. Sequin, of course, has worked very over the years when we're talking about women in public spaces. It came to the forefront, of course, with the gang rape, Jyoti's gang rape. We were working in the space much before that with our football girls. Again, we have a lot of interns who intern with the football project, claiming the spaces for our football girls. That's one of the ways that we negotiated public space for them. And I'm sure you'll hear a lot more about this topic from our panelists. But do think about this. Do really think about how you can use your time, volunteer your time, especially at the moment with COVID. Yes, you may not be able to go out to the community, but you may. There are people who have been helping with relief work, and we've been doing things like that. So keeping in mind your personal scenario and what you can do, I would urge you really to give your time to any kind of organization that you feel is dedicated. Dia, back to you.
So thank you everybody for being here. Before we start, I'd request all the core team members to just put on their camera for a quick photograph before we start.
Who is taking the picture?
I'm taking it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'd like to thank Sequin and JDMC for support and freedom to put this two-part webinar series together. It's truly been a labor of love for all 7 of us collaborating from different institutions to curate this. The pandemic has really shown us the power of technology and perhaps rapidly increased the pace at which people venture online. We have seen the lockdown blurring the distinctions between public spaces and private spaces. As students, we've seen how our social media has transformed from just a space for our self-expression to a fantastic tool to reach out to others. Today's panel has been a true reflection of this tool, and I really want to thank each one of them for taking their time out to share their thoughts with us. This entire period has really brought out a need to reevaluate the understanding of space, ensuring it's equitable and safe for everybody as we move forward. Without wasting any more time, I'm going to hand it over to my colleague Anvita, who will take this forward. Anvita, over to you.
Thank you, Dia, and good afternoon to one and all present here. I'd like to introduce our first panelist, Ms. Ankita Gujjar. She is an associate professor of sociology and anthropology at St. Xavier's, Mumbai. Her work is focused mainly on gender in popular culture, media studies, and women aspirations. Good afternoon, ma'am. You're muted.
Yeah. Hi, everyone. First of all, a big thank you to and to Janki Devi Memorial College for having us. And without further ado, I will start since I have 10 minutes. Just to refresh what I was told to prepare for, in a sense, was the question. Anvita, am I audible?
Yeah, you are audible.
Okay, all right. What constitutes the public and private space in the context of fluidity in these constructs, particularly during pandemic times? The approach that I am taking to attempting to answer this question to the extent that one can in a situation when we're caught in the middle of it is a rights-based approach. So if you're looking at women's empowerment, particularly in a system of patriarchy when there is violence against them at multiple levels, there is a particular criteria called epistemic violence that I'm looking at, and particularly how that violates certain rights that women can have access to empower themselves further. We have to understand that within a rights and freedom-based approach, when we're looking at the public and the private, are we looking at the domestic versus the non-domestic? The domestic space does not always afford us privacy, as Dr. Pal said when she spoke about how there is a higher level of surveillance on what women do, particularly with regards to permissions that they need to get. The non-domestic space is, in fact, to a large extent, more constraining in habit for a lot of people, for a lot of women as well, and particularly for growing adolescent girls too. Coming from an education space, for me, the college has always been a space of community, of expression, and of an ability to engage with people who can think along similar lines. It's not always bound by the conservatism of what your household can bring from time to time, from what the domestic can bring from time to time. So with looking at even not just college, but also at other spaces of recreation, whether these are your leisure classes or your hobby classes, it allows you a sense of community building and of access to skills and resources that you can gather to further develop yourself and empower yourself. Now, this can lead to financial empowerment. It can lead to, a status achievement that is often valued as well. Within this, what we're looking at as the rights that women often don't have access to, with the kind of surveillance that happens within family spaces, within private spaces, as opposed to perhaps happening less in public spaces. There are three rights that I'm going to talk about, because as an educator, these are rights that are extremely important, and we're looking at violence as not just physical, but also epistemic. Epistemic violence is basically the ability to, the limitation of the ability to access knowledge, and the limitation of the ability to generate one's own truth and get it validated as something that is legitimate knowledge as well. To explain this, I mean, that standpoint theory tells you that my opinion coming from my space, my social location, would be construed like this, and then intersectionality also sort of, covers the same thing with a larger umbrella of sorts. If I'm using too many jargonized terms, Dia, please call me out and let me know that I have to simplify. Um, when we're looking at epistemic violence, we're looking at the right to information, the right to create their own truths, and the right to privacy that helps us have both of these. Without the right to privacy, as we often know, our technology is surveilled by parents up to a certain age, and I think some of us find ways around it by some of us have parents who are not as savvy with technology, but our access in terms of time to it can always be limited. Um, I will give you examples later, of course. When we're looking at the right to privacy and the right to information, the home is not always a safe space. And I think we vacillate between understanding the home as a safe space versus the home as a space that creates more vulnerability, because you're supposed to have people that you can trust, but that's not always true when it comes to domestic violence. Um, and within this space, a particular concept that fascinates me, when we talk of patriarchy as an institution that exists in the family, that exists in education, particularly in the family in this situation, is the idea that Foucault has of biopower. Now, biopower is any institutionalized surveillance of the body of the individual. And when we're looking at this idea, this pandemic has led to an increase in the intensity of different violations of women's rights that aren't already concretized in the private space or in the domestic space, for a better sort of pointed understanding of it. Um, in this situation, there are several examples that I can think of, particularly the privacy to learn, the privacy to educate the self by using technology. I think one of the things that is happening with educational institutions across, okay, if you're looking at educational institutions as community safe spaces, and what's happening over there in terms of a knee-jerk reaction to do everything online, all right? We're saying, all right, let's go online with our classes, let's go online with our exams, let's go online. Online is the way to go. To a certain extent, yes, because it brings the classroom to the students, to the child. But at the same time, what it's also doing is that it's increasing the surveillance from other members of the family on what kind of information are you learning. This ability to learn freely without judgment from within already a non-adjusted space. We're talking particularly about non-well-adjusted family spaces where there is a generative scheme of violence that occurs. You are looking at the idea of privacy and control over technology and access to technology that women are allowed to have. There are three examples that I can give for this. I was working with the Maharashtra State Women's Commission and Action Aid for a project, and one of the girls said, किसी भी लड़के के साथ अगर रास्ते पे देख लिया ना तो पहली चीज होती है हमारा फोन ले लेते हैं. The thing is, when not all families have access to personal computers or laptop, if you're saying that all students have a smartphone, control over a girl's access to educational technologies like the smartphone, if that's the first thing that's going to be sanctioned, that is an assertion of the sort of institutionalized biopower that's happening. Another thing is, the girls often would say that we are asked more questions about what we are doing on the computer or how are we using the computer and the phone, as opposed to their brother using it, for example. Okay, and that is also a form of epistemic violence, where you're not allowed to have access to that kind of information. You're not allowed to generate your truth by having adequate time to think through your ideas, having adequate time to access material about your ideas as well. Another example can also be seen in this regard as the whole hierarchy of who uses the technology more and for what productive potential or what productive value. So a boy's job in the family, in the household, is always considered more important, and therefore the boy gets the computer, the elder brother or the younger brother gets the computer for a longer time, depending on what kind of course they're doing, as opposed to a girl getting access to the computer. And this differential access in terms of hours to a singular technological setup that exists within the household is also a form of violation of the rights of the girl child, to look at sort of the idea of privacy, to look at the idea of expression, and of potential social mobility. Um, when we are talking about my experience with a student recently who kind of was extremely worried about the ethnography course, and in the ethnography course we have a title, we have a chapter titled Anthropology of Sex and Gender. It's a precursor to some of the third year papers that they take up, and the girl was extremely worried about taking up two papers. One was the anthropology of the ethnography paper, and the other one was the psychology of gender paper, because of course we're talking of sexuality, we are talking of certain issues related to the LGBTQ plus community. And she was worried that when she was reading the articles that had the term sexuality in it, or if I sent a video from YouTube that had anything to do with the expression of the self, if her family was in the same room, she could not access that material. So would it be available at all times? So you're also looking at a certain conservatism that disallows us from women being able to access certain issues and certain information about issues that are integral to their self-growth and learning as well, and their empowerment too. In this situation, the surveillance of the family is an exertion of biopower, of patriarchy, of controlling women's bodies and their brains and their minds as well. Um, the question then becomes, when public spaces are relatively more shut off, not that public spaces have the same level of freedom every single time, of course, but when they're relatively shut off during a pandemic, how do we create these safe spaces for adolescent children and for women as well? And one is that it's an individual case by case basis, to sort of allow them to the space to express themselves. And the second is also understanding that the sensitization to this rights-based discourse has to be done. Um, I think I'm almost out of time, if I'm not mistaken. So I'll just make a couple of points and I'll end my 10-minute session here. Um, Along with this, you also have what I think Sarah Abdullah Pilot talked about, which is construction of leisure can't always be done at home for women. If you're at home, then you're expected to sort of take on traditional gender roles as well. Ki tum ghar pe ho to tum hi kar do. Like you're at home now, so why don't you just cook this also? Why don't you experiment more in the kitchen? Or why don't you, instead of the guy getting to get up a glass of water, it would be the woman who gets up and does the service for the waiting on for the man. So in a sense, if she is able to construct leisure in the public space, she's not allowed to construct leisure in the home space, because the home is her space of functioning smoothly, or keeping it functioning smoothly. And there as well, the right to expression, the right to self-develop, the right to live with dignity is threatened again. So in this kind of a situation, the public-private, when you're looking at the idea of private, are you looking at the idea of privacy, or are you looking at the idea of the domestic space is not giving access to certain rights to women of all classes and intersections? The last point that I want to make is, it will be interesting to see how the idea of veiling and unveiling is also looked at, because there is a hierarchy in the public space when it comes to majoritarian groups and minority groups about the idea of the veil. And we're so used to now having a sort of veil on our face, of masking our faces, and it's almost a uniform of sorts. And we've kind of gone into a space where we veil for medical reasons, and that somewhere has taken a justificatory mechanism of its own, that we have to veil ourselves to be out in the public space. And how are we going to look at the scarf or the mask versus traditional religious veils that are taken over? So it's interesting to see these negotiations taking place as we navigate more into the non-domestic space with biases that come in from society, and we move into the private space with biases that come in from within the household as well. So I ended there. It's 3:25. So yeah, I'll take questions later. Yeah.
Thank you, ma'am, for that. I'd like to now introduce Dr. Kalpana Vishwanath. She is the co-founder and CEO of Safety Pin. She has worked on issues of gender and urbanization for over 20 years with several organizations. She's a member of the advisory group on gender issues at UN Habitat and is a board member at International Center for the Prevention of Crime. Good afternoon, ma'am.
Hi, good afternoon.
Uh,
Am I audible?
yeah,
Clearly?
yes, you are audible.
So first of all, thank you to Janki Devi and Sequin. Both are institutions that I have personally been worked with, partnered with individuals, and Safety Pin as an organization, and Jaguri, where I'm also part of. We worked very closely with both JDM teachers, students in the past, as well as Sequin. So I'm actually delighted to be here and to speak to students. It's always wonderful to speak to young people and get your inputs and feedback, and also to be part of a panel with uh, with so many, with such a diverse panel, and of course Shilpa Patke, who we've been working on this issue together for many years. So again, the question that I'm going to be addressing, which was posed to me, was really to look at, in the context of COVID-19, what have been the impacts on women's lives, especially in the context of what is being called the shadow pandemic of violence against women. So if we look at the nature of impact of COVID-19 on women's lives, women, young women, girls' lives, there are really three broad areas that we can identify. One is in looking at the work of care. Secondly is on violence. And the third is in terms of mobility and public space. Now, when we look at the work of care, it has really come to the forefront during this period, where especially in India, in middle-class Indian households, there has been a sudden sort of situation where people have had to take on all the work of care ourselves, because as a middle class, upper middle class, many people are used to a lot of other people performing the work of care. Now, if we look at globally, what this means is that, I mean, care work globally is seen, there's been enough statistics and studies even by ILO, which show that women do across the world approximately 3 times the amount of work of care that men do. In India, it's even higher, in the subcontinent, and in the context of Indian patriarchy, where the burden of not just housework, and I keep saying the work of care because it is not just cooking and cleaning, but it is all the other work, which is child care, elder care, often even teaching in the context of today's time when schools are closed. So the burden of the work of care has tremendously increased in this period. While there have been, some instances, certainly positive ones, where men have taken on some of the burden. We are seeing social media full of pictures of men who have cooked and cleaned and are doing jharu, pocha, but we know that the burden, the majority of this burden is still being borne by women, young women and girls in households. And we know that women who already carry a triple burden, the women who work outside, they continue to have to work outside through working from home. They continue to have the work of care, as well as reproductive work of looking after children. And in the case where now schools are all closed, they're having to take over homeschooling. And this is leading to tremendous impacts on women's lives, including what we are just beginning to see is a very high mental health impact on women's lives for the amount of extra work, burden, stress that they're having to take on. The other very, very large issue that has come up is the one of domestic violence, of different forms of violence that are taking place within the home. And this is not just in India. This we know is a global phenomenon. The UN statistics tell us that 1 in 3 women are victims of violence at some point of their lives. Different forms of violence. It could be domestic, it could be public space, it could be sexual harassment of the workplace, etc. But during this period, of a lockdown where everyone was said, stay home to stay safe. For women, I'm not even talking about the hundreds of thousands of people who were not in a home, who didn't have the option to get to a home, which was an entire different form of violence that took place in our country quite uniquely, which did not happen in many other countries. But for women, where the home has never been a safe space, to suddenly be completely locked into your home, where you cannot step out, nor can your abuser step out. The kind of pressure this led on in women's lives was is why it's being called a shadow pandemic. So, for example, the statistics have shown us that even in other countries, so in France, during the period beginning March, mid-March, there was a 30% increase in reporting of domestic violence in the country. In other countries, similarly, there was increase in Argentina. There was a 25% increase in reporting of violence. Even in a country in Asia, in Singapore, there was 33% increase in reporting. Through some other methods which have been used, like looking at Google searches, it was found that the number of searches for resources for violence against women had tremendously gone up in many countries in this period. So we know that this has increased. In India, the National Commission for Women actually introduced a new helpline, a WhatsApp helpline at this period, for women to be able to record to share the information and ask for help in different ways. Women's groups have also been doing a lot of work around this. Initially, some of the data did show that there were two kinds of data. One, at the NCW helpline actually showed that there was nearly 50% increase in reporting of domestic violence from the period of March 22nd when the lockdown took place. In some other cases, like many other helplines that women's groups were running, there was actually a dip in new cases and there were many more calls from existing cases. We know that there are many reasons for this. This includes both the fact that there was probably no space in the household to actually go to pick up the phone in a private place and talk about the fact that you were facing violence. The digital divide that has already been spoken about, where who has access to the phone in the home? When everybody is at home, how much access do women and girls actually get to it in order to either search for information or use it to seek help? And if we look at that, I think in the context of COVID, there are a couple of other elements we need to look at. For example, globally, 70% of health and social service workers are women. So a lot of the burden of the COVID-19 work of care, even in public settings, has been taken on by women. And it has led to, of course, many where they continue to have several other burdens that they are doing. We know that women have many people have lost jobs in this period, right? So ILO estimates actually that 2.7 billion workers have been impacted in this period in some way or the other, either losing jobs or losing part of their salary or money or any other thing. Now, we also know we have a very large informal economy, and women, 70% of the labor is in the informal economy, so we don't even know how much they're being counted in all these elements. But what can we do? I think I really want to spend the last few minutes in looking forward, in saying that how is this pandemic, how is this moment in history going to help us, going to open the possibility of imagining a different future? People have talked about build back better. What does build back better mean? What are the kind of services that we need? So we know that, for example, in terms of violence, the kind of services that are needed are, one is immediate response emergency services, but also psychosocial support. And this, I would say, across the board, probably not just for women and girls, but psychosocial mental health counseling is something that is is needed and is going to be needed in the following months. And a third, I think, is a strong message on impunity. The United Nations, other bodies have actually talked about it at this point, that as much as the pandemic is there, we need to look at all other ways in which people who are already vulnerable are going to be further marginalized and discriminated and lose power, disempowered in this process. And therefore, I think when we look at some of the interesting, there have been some interesting even kind of strategies that have been used. One was, we talked about some countries, they've actually said instead of the woman having to leave her house when she reports violence, actually to get the abuser to leave the house. Because many women would not want to leave the home if there are children there. Using technology, using other people, other existing sort of services. So, for example, in the UK, the postal service was used as a way to get women to be able to report their experiences, and also virtual justice systems. And I think as we move forward, we need to really say that we need good disaggregated data about not just the virus and not just the impact of the virus in a health sense, but in every other sense, in terms of economic impact, in terms of violence, in terms of social, psychosocial impact. How do we get good data? Secondly, as we move forward and rebuild our systems, we are going to look at how do we put women's voices at the center? How do we ensure it's not business as usual when we rebuild? How do we strengthen services, increase awareness, and not go back? I mean, I don't know, when you say new normal, old normal, I think the normal itself was deeply problematic. So when we are revisioning a future, what is it that we're looking at? And finally, my last point, and I think Shilpa will take us on much more, is really the public, not just the private space or the nature of the public space transformed tremendously in this period for everybody. And as we open up, how is the public space going to be gender sensitive, gender friendly, gender responsive, in a time of physical distancing, in a time of much less services that are going to be available? Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. I'd like to now introduce our third panelist, Dr. Shilpa Phadke. She is an associate professor at IISc Mumbai. She is a researcher and writer and has written widely on feminism and gender equality in relation to urban geography and the public. Good afternoon, ma'am.
Good afternoon. Can you hear me?
Yeah, perfectly.
And it's clear?
Yeah, it's clear.
Okay.
So, ma'am, I'd like to ask you, what have been the struggles for women to access public spaces, and what kind of pushback do you think there will be?
Thanks, Ankita. And thank you so much, Janki Devi College and Sequin, Dia and others for inviting me to be part of this exciting panel. In this short intervention, I will focus on the question of public space in the last few decades. You can hear me, right? Yeah, okay, I'm assuming I'm audible.
Yes, Shilpa, you're audible. Yeah.
Thanks. So I focus on the question of public space in the last few decades. Since the early part of this century, the conversation on safety for women seems to stare at us from every mainstream newspaper. However, it's unfortunately not linked to access in any way. It is fundamentally about the control of women's mobility through acts of surveillance, as Ankita just talked about, which are offered to us as protection and even as expressions of love. However, the feminist discourse on gendered public space in India and South Asia has evolved to one which increasingly focuses on women's right to the public, including the right to fun in public. That is the right to loiter, to hang out, to wander. When we first presented our work arguing, and this is in the early 2000s, arguing that what women needed in order to access public space was the right to take risks and loiter in public, we were asked by many people, including feminist academics and activists, why women would want to loiter, since even good men did not loiter. Now, and this is 15 or 15 years later, not only is that question not being asked, but the word loitering has entered a feminist lexicon and is often used by people who may not even have seen or read our work. So what I intend to do is focus on this feminist discourse and the fluidity of the public-private divide as it relates to it in this pandemic. India has seen what is widely recognized as the harshest lockdown in the world, which has managed, as Kalpana just pointed out, to push privileged citizens inside. The daily wage laborers, especially the migrants among them, were left without any recourse. And we have seen the kind of humanitarian crisis that has emerged from that. What I'm going to dwell on, though, is this pressure to be inside, to be in the private space, where now the enemy is a virus. For women, however, the outside has always been defined as threatening, especially after dark. And women were urged to be inside, which, as Kalpana pointed out, was implicitly seen as safe, despite the fact that across the world, the largest proportion of any kind of violence against women is committed in private spaces by people known to them. I won't dwell on this, but I just wanted to sort of, in response to something Kalpana suggested about getting abusers to leave the home, it's worth recounting one creative response by the Zilla Parishad in Pune, who in fact decided to send men who were accused of domestic violence to institutional quarantine centers run by the district administration in an effort to flip the usual practice where women are the ones sent to shelter homes. Part of the question of the public relates to claim, right? While women have far less claim to the public than men, they also have far less claim to the private. It's not as if they claim ownership of the private. And this push back and this push inside has made that even clearer. But what might an initiative like this, that asks the abuser to leave and which enshrines women's place in the home, mean for claims to the home? Even where homes are safe from physical harm, as Kalpana pointed out, women face an additional burden of care. For those who work in paid employment, this means being available 24/7, not just in the home, but also to your employers. We find increasingly that employers think that now you're working for them and you're home. So, and it's worth also reflecting on the politics of the language of care. What does it mean when we say that men help in their own homes? What does it mean when the lockdown is used as a platform to offer jokes about men being stuck at home with their nagging wives? And I think it's important for us to reflect on the question of paid employment. Since 2005, and so this is not new, the percentage of Indian women in paid work has dropped from 35% to less than 24%. And the pandemic has only exacerbated this, as many more women than men have lost jobs. Since education equality have sought access to the public, these losses pushing women back inside might have very serious consequences, which might take us back decades. Now, while I'm sorry, I'm back. Can you hear me? It dropped for a minute.
Yes, you're audible now.
Okay. So I'm just going to go back a bit, assuming that you all missed some of it. So since 2000, at what point did it drop, Ankita?
So you were pretty audible up to the point that you made about the lexicon. It's entered the lexicon, and it's the LGBTQ movement, the feminist lexicon. Loitering as a term has entered that. That's where I lost you.
Wow, that's long ago, yeah?
Yeah, that's like a couple of points ago. Yeah, 2 points, I think you.
Okay, okay. I'm just going to back up a bit then, okay? Listen, no, that's long ago. So I'm so sorry, Ankita, is that how long ago I became inaudible?
Anvita, if you can just, maybe it was my internet also over here that was glitching a bit.
Anvita, are you there?
Actually,
language of care. Sorry, language
I heard
of care.
you till the time you're talking about the data from 2005. I heard.
Oh, okay, great. Thanks, Kalpana. Fine. Okay. Okay, so going to this data from 2005, the percentage of Indian women in paid work has dropped from 35% to 24%, and the pandemic has meant that many more women have lost jobs. What does this mean now that women have lost jobs, and it might have serious consequences which might take us back decades? What does it mean if women do not have work to go back to? In India, just before the pandemic hit, we had huge protests against the Citizenship Amendment Act passed in December 2019 that, as you all know, made religion, that is being Muslim, specifically the basis of discrimination. And what we saw were very large numbers of us out on the streets, up in arms, protesting. Universities were up in arms. Universities were, of course, being attacked for their protests. There were also, and we saw this, a growing number of sit-ins across the country, many of which were led by women, often Muslim women. Many had women on the front line, sometimes in response to our laws, which say that no woman can be arrested after sunset and without the presence of a female constable. Many of these women protesters were visible and articulate, claiming the public as citizens with rights. The pandemic, as we have seen, has provided the state with an excuse to dismantle these protests, right? The protests were abruptly halted, the sit-ins systematically broken up, and signs of protest erased. The most famous of these, that is Shaheen Bagh in Delhi, has had almost all of the iconography and installations associated with it painted over in a very, very clear effort to erase any kind of visibility of this protest, to erase the memory of this protest. However, at the same time, even as the pandemic continues and there are rising numbers, the democratic activists, many of them women, are being jailed and denied bail, right? Two of these are part of the organization Pinjara Tod, which began by campaigning for women's rights to the city and to safe, accessible and affordable housing. As a result of the lockdown, all of us who might otherwise have been on the streets protesting these arrests can only protest by writing open letters and by mobilizing on online platforms. And in a sense, our protests are also pushed inside, as it were. But the online, of course, is far from a private space. Reflecting on the online, it's important to complicate our understanding of the public-private divide and the idea of privacy itself. When we think of the home as private, we think of it in physical terms. But privacy is also, as Ankita pointed out, about information and the agency to share information as we choose or not. In India, we are being asked to download the Arogya Setu app that will facilitate tracking individuals, ostensibly to enable contact tracing in relation to the virus. But we live in a state that we do not trust, nor do we desire to be visible to. What happens when our bodies are seen as data points? What kind of boundaries can we frame in relation to whom we are visible to and whom we might choose to be visible to, right? So now we're concerned not only about our families and our families sort of tracking us, but we're also concerned about the state. Even as we think about our bodies as data points, raising concerns of privacy, we need to continue to reflect on the nature of the embodied self online. Further, the effort to digitally understand and pigeonhole the body, to fix us into slots, takes away from our capacity to become and to evolve and to exercise agency about how we might see ourselves and our bodies at different moments. Just weeks before the Citizenship Act was passed, the Transgender Persons Protection of Rights Bill became an act in November 2019. Which, among other things, took away trans people's right to self-identify. What happens when the gendered body is sought to be located statically? How do we engage when the state refuses us the right to present ourselves as we see ourselves at any given time? Even as our protests are forced online, this is a space that feminists, especially younger feminists, have been able to successfully engage with to forge transnational movements, including those in relation to public space. In India and across the border in Pakistan, feminist movements in the last 2 decades, like Blank Noise, Girls at Dhabas, Pinjara Tod, all of them claiming access to the public in different ways, have built conversations across our very fraught borders, pushing our understanding of how both feminist activism might take place, and also how feminist communities might be formed and sustained. The question, though, here is how do we reflect on the corporately owned platforms on which we are compelled to mount our political campaigns for freedom? What does it mean then to mount these battles on Twitter or Facebook or Instagram? Even as we continue to sustain these gains online, and even as the public is cast as dangerous now in a different way, we must not lose sight of the gains we have made in the last 2 decades in access to the public. The idea of loitering, once marginal and problematic, is at least within feminist circles taken for granted. The pandemic will eventually pass, but other kinds of contexts of right-wing fundamentalism, neoliberalism, and misogyny are not on any kind of timeline. I conclude with some questions that I'm grappling with. How, I wonder, in the face of the pandemic and state clampdowns, will we re-access the public, reclaim the streets for protest and pleasure, and build on the claims to the public? What does it mean to be pushed inside and to think of the outside from the inside? What does the public mean in this context? What does it mean to be political in a pandemic? How might we think of feminist communities now? How might we build and sustain radical political movements? And how might such feminist solidarities be imagined in a pandemic? Thank you. I'm sorry that for the drop.
Thank you, ma'am, for that. I'd now like to introduce Ms. Santa Kurai. She is a social activist, writer, and artist. Her poems have been published by HarperCollins, and her translated memoirs are being published by Speaking Tiger. Her work focuses on the research of socio-economic inclusion of underprivileged community and people. Good afternoon, ma'am. Ma'am, you're on mute.
Hello?
Yes, ma'am. Yes.
Yeah, am I audible?
Yes, yes.
Okay, so yeah, I'm very glad to be a part of this discussion because being counting me as a what to say as a speaker among all these perfect and expert women, it's a very wonderful space for me. So like when uh, I'm not an academia nor a researcher, but actually I would be happy to share my lived experience, how I have been compromising my gender identity, body ecology, because with the society and in different space. So the trans community, first of all, I would like to reflect a bit about the realities of Manipur, uh, the lived realities of Manipur, because transgender peoples in Manipur, they live with their family and they don't have a colony. They don't follow a certain culture like Hijra, because this is one uniqueness, a tradition of transgender in Manipur. So like, uh, even though we able to have the opportunity to live with our family, getting support from our family, we still question about the recognition of our transness and the transgender identity. When talking about the transgender marriage or else set of independent family for the transgender peoples, there has been no recognition or acceptance neither from the family, from the society, nor the government authority. So talking about this, I would also like to reflect here, like what our life is vulnerable with or without COVID, and the sudden outbreak of this pandemic has really hit to our economy, our mental health, which I think it's very important to address mental health. Because almost all the trans population in Manipur, they were running beauty parlor, they work in beauty parlor, and for the trans men, they were working as daily wages before the lockdown. And then the implementation of the lockdown has really hit to their economy, and now the community has shut their business and then had stopped earning, which really gave a very negative impact to their mental health, because of the sense of the looming sense of lost their job, and then they also doesn't have a fallback option to live on. So because like when they were able to earn money, the money which they earned were all provided to the family. They have supported, they have given a complete support to their family. So the question here is like, because of the lockdown, they have lost their job, they were not able to continue earning. And then the relationship between the family members and the community begins conflict. There is conflict between the family members and the transgender community. This is not only of the financial support which they are not able to provide to their family members. This is also because of the long association which they have got with their family members. Uh, eh, Before the lockdown, they will be leaving home early in the morning and then came back late in the evening, which gives a very less chance to live with their family. And also that negates the view of their what to say, their uh, acute behavior and natures which they express their transness. And then living with the family for a longer period of time in a day, meaning like the family have started surveillance towards them of and then they got to know our behavior in depth. And then this makes this create a conflict between the family members and the trans community. And on the other hand, we also need to look upon the, the socio-cultural and political association that has been associated with the community. In Manipur, the realities are very, very much different. When we talk about the gender consciousness, then there is no gender consciousness at all. And then in a place where there is a lot of conflicts in everyday life, it's again very difficult to start off a discourse about the gender equality. So transgender issues are always at the sideline, and we have a very lesser chance to open up discourse on our identity, our acceptance, and our legal reformation. Um, so this is one concern which I think is also need to address here, because like when uh, when people are still considering our gender identity like what's between your two legs, they are always play our body as as an object. They are subjectify our gender identity, which means it's very, very what to say, it's a very big obstacles in the development of human rights. Because for example, in my case, I'm married to a person who is outsiders, who is not from Manipur, and he left Manipur recently. Now he wanted to come back, return back to Manipur, and then I'm still wondering for a place, for a quarantine center where I can put him. Because like even outside people's marrying to outside people's, it's a big concern for the for Manipur community. And if I was in a case of a cisgender women, the difficulties that I have been facing right now could be lesser. Because like people accept the relationship between a cisgender and one outsiders. Maybe they also have difficulties, they have also challenges due to the social norms. And then we also have this moment of what to say, indigeneity, and then preservation of indigenous culture, or and then protecting our population. But still, at least to some extent, cisgender people, cisgender women who married to one outsider still have a space to have the discourse, to engage in the conversation. But for a transgender women like me, I don't have a space where I can put up this discourse and then have the conversation. So these are the things which, and then the question about when we look gender as a whole, I have been I have been engaging in intersectionality in many women's movement in Manipur, but actually I found many of the time that I left out. I had the feeling of left out, because like I was always in the corner and then people corner me. So this question me the question of who are the real women, and then who are the what to say, who are not real women. But actually the question of gender is not about who is real and who is unreal. The question is about gender. Gender is not in the legs. Gender cannot be defined with individual genital part, but actually it's all about how a person identify themselves, how a person identify themselves, in what way, in what manner the person wanted to express a gender expression. So these are the whole things. And if we look on to the national scenario also, recently we all knows very well about the Delhi Metro railway station, which was renamed as Seaman. So that word itself is a very big insult to the community. Seaman meaning like a person. It has introduced a new terminology that has a mixture of men and women. So it's a big insult, and then many of the community members, including me, had protested that name and then was again changed to rainbow. How it happens? Because it's totally going to be dedicated to the transgender community. How come the rainbow flag there? Because there is also a question of gender identity and sexuality, which are two independent entity. You cannot conflate gender identity with the sexuality identity, and this has to be the this initiative is totally completely dedicated to the transgender people. And then why the center has come up with a new name like rainbow? This really doesn't mean that I'm very segregating from the rainbow flag, but actually I would also like to address the issues of the needs of the transgender community specifically, because we are the people who had drop out school in the middle because of bullied, because of stigma, because of the exclusion and rejection in the family. And with this pandemic, with this coming of the pandemic, and which is followed by the complete lockdown, how it has severely affected to the transgender community is, just like an example, we had a story recently. It happens yesterday, because they had a conflict. The trans man, he is my junior, and we have been working together all these years long, and he committed suicide, and he attempted suicide, and he was shot because of that. The reason behind her attempt to suicide was the family conflict and the intimate partner relationship conflict. So we, the transgender community, are vulnerable at any point of time. And then with this pandemic, it has pushed the community to a very disastrous environment which they have never prepared before. So negotiating gender in space, in public space, and everywhere, whatever it is, but actually for us, it's all mixed up, and then we cannot pick up the things which one is more important to give priority to address the issue. We are overall holistically vulnerable, and we do not have a point where we can start off the discourse, where to, and then how to go about. So this is a very challenging thing. And talking about the cisgender women issues, in relation with this lockdown, is, in my experience, many of the women, including a widow, uh, they are struggling to get a mobile phone, and or else a kind of technology which they can easily access to online education. Because these women, they have both sons and daughter. Hello.
Yes, ma'am, you're audible.
Okay, I think somebody has mute. Somebody is in mute, so there is echo coming. Yeah. So yeah, okay. So in this experience, what I got to know is many of the women who belongs to the low income family, they have very less access to this online education. And in Manipur, whether the parents are very poor, they may be starving a day, but actually they send their children to English medium schools. So the schools have started sending home assignment on like WhatsApp and then Facebook Messenger, which they are not able to access, and the mobile phone which they use, like keypad mobile, which is commonly used for having a basic communication. And then these mothers, they have visited my house and using my phone, my smartphone, and then one tablet. But actually, the mothers are not limited. There are numbers of mothers who wanted to access to this technology. And on the other hand, I have also found that they have given those mothers who have their smartphone, they have given this smartphone to their boys children. They have trusted more to the boys children. I feel like this because like the smartphone, they have handed over it to their boys children, to their sons for a long period of time, when compared with their daughters. So like the these boys, they constantly using this smartphone, whether they are using this smartphone just to access the online education or else for some other reason. So we fail to understand this, and then there is no such research or study which is intending to conduct. So like there is also this possibility of getting getting technology addiction to these boys children. And then one things which I have initiated is like along with our local senior, we have opened one small library where all boys and girls can access, and then we have started keeping books there. And so this could be a space where we can start off the discourse of having gender equality, because like when we talk about gender equality, we cannot always focus on men and women. We have to start it from the beginning. We have to start it from the young, young age, so that they can at least understand the need. And then it's not about understanding, they can at least have the habit of being together, both boys and girls. So these are the things which we have initiated. And also when we talk about this gender equality, we also need to look on two perspectives. One is human rights perspective, and then the other one is the realities, the reality that women and transgender face in their day-to-day life. Because like many of the peoples are not aware of human rights principle. So and even among the women also, there are very few people who are engaging in feminism discourse, and then who are very well illiterate, and then have very good knowledge of human rights perspective. But actually, for all those women who are in the working class and then who are the domestic workers, they really don't have these ideas of human rights. And without knowing at least understanding of their rights, how can they assert for their rights? They will be victim, and then when they 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 become a victim, then the society and the family members will victimize them. Because for this also we need a larger discourse. We need to expand of this discourse to a larger forum. Okay.
Um,
Thank you. Yeah.
okay, thank you, ma'am, for that. I'll now move on to the next speaker, Ms. Nikita Wadhwa. She is a coordinator for the Collective Impact Partnership at Rise Up. Her experience involves designing and implementation of programs with women, adolescent girls, and youth around a gamut of issues, including ending gender disparity, gender-based violence, and active citizenship. Good afternoon, ma'am.
Good afternoon. Thank you so much for having me here. And thank you so much for all this insightful discussion that we've had up till this point.
Thank you for joining us.
Thank you. The topic that I'm speaking about is, given the gender gap in digital access, is there a fear of women getting excluded? And with the right kind of resources and policies, do you think this could be an opportunity for the gap to be bridged in the new economy? So, like after hearing some of the points that the panelists have already made, it's brought to light the fact that the internet is this space where we're still figuring out. It's a public space and mirrors some of the inequalities that women face in the public space on the internet. And as well as, it is a private, handheld, personal moment interaction with the internet. So some of the discrimination that is faced in private spaces also gets coupled into women's relationship with the internet. The gender gap in India is very real on the internet. In India, there are only about 35% women of all, 35% of all Indian women are using the internet. We have the second largest population of internet users in the world. We have 500 million internet users, which is the second largest online population. But of that number, only about 30% are women. And again, the discrimination and the inequalities that women are subject to off the internet are mirrored on the internet. So of that 30%, about 12% are women who are accessing the internet from rural areas, and the remaining 18% are urban women. So what are the kind of barriers that women are facing while accessing the internet? First of all, there is definitely a lack of infrastructure to be considered. We all know that Digital India as a program has been active since 2015, but unfortunately, in rural areas, which houses about 2/3 of our population in India, a fully functional internet is only available to about 25% of those areas. Urban spaces have about 97% of coverage, but rural spaces are lacking behind. And that's just the situation in tech infrastructure available for internet access. In the South Asian context, which includes India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, as a couple of panelists have also stated before, men are more likely to have a smartphone than women. Women are about 26% likely to have a smartphone in India. That is, it mirrors the inequality. There is a fear of technology. Technology is seen as the men's realm, and there's a fear of it, and therefore, there is that disparity in terms of how many women own smartphone devices through which they can access the internet. In my experiences with older women, there is another hurdle on that front. With older women, I work on a program where we're training women to be more visible on the internet and take their leadership online to the internet. So, with older women, the challenge is that if they haven't grown up with technology and if they haven't, interacted with it, even ownership of a smartphone doesn't necessarily translate into using it as we would on a daily basis. The other challenge with younger women, as Ankita pointed out very strongly, is that there is so much patriarchal control in so many areas that there is a control over women's bodies, interactions, and therefore that sort of extends into how they're interacting with their cell phones and using the internet. So there is a very real situation of women getting excluded from the online space, even though there are so many advantages, and we can go over how many advantages exist. Like, for example, with Digital India, the idea is that women's identification, they can access their Aadhaar cards, ration cards and stuff by, having access by filling in forms on the internet. If that's the disparity in terms of access, how are women going to take advantage of all of the, digital space available to them and the benefits of being online? The other barriers that exist are there aren't very strong laws in place. Cyberbullying and cyber stalking are not defined by Indian law in terms of crime and implementation, unfortunately, of acts making the internet a safe space and encouraging more girls to be online. There is a long way to go on that front. And I think the other challenge is the lack of role models. How many women do we see as leaders of technology? And we talk about the Facebooks and the Googles and tech spaces in the world. Even worldwide, there are so many more men than women. In India, how many women do we know who are actually role models to young women and girls to be online and be in technology? As the pandemic has told us that, the internet is as much a public space, and it isn't a secondary space anymore. Like, we're going to have to look at it as a primary space of interaction. And therefore, we need to address the inequalities that are showing up so much. Technology is a space where women's voices, which has potential for women's voices being heard, and the connection of women across the world, across the globe, for that connection to be fostered. We've all seen the Me Too movement and the power and impact that it has had. women have connected over sexual violence and have made it a global movement, where women's voices have been heard and have been connected together to say that this is not okay. And we've seen that that's been taken seriously, and there is repercussions, and there is conversation around the issue happening globally. Therefore, this is the time when we say that the digital space is the space to make that sort of movement. We've seen in smaller programs that women who are online are able to earn additional incomes, increase employment opportunities, access knowledge and general information. And overall, women's leadership has been evident throughout this pandemic. 70% of our healthcare and frontline workers globally are women whose voices need to be heard. Countries where women leaders have led the fight against the pandemic have done significantly better than other countries. This is the moment where we take more women online. Some things that we can invest in as solutions are, there are a couple of examples of programs that I have. The program that I work on has an online partner called World Pulse, where the idea is that we take women's voices, women and girls get online and talk about their lived experience, their daily issues, and create global advocacy for their issues. So I encourage you to check it out. World Pulse is a women's platform. Currently, they have a campaign going on, which is called She Creates Tech, which is, it's starting with a space which encourages women to come online and share their experiences of the internet, so as to build a global narrative of women in technology and how much things need to change for more women to be accessing technology. The other program that I'm quite inspired by is the Internet Sathi program that was a collaboration between Tata Trust and Google India, where they trained women across 3 lakh villages in India on a smartphone usage. And they gave them a smartphone, and they've seen the unintended consequences of that program have included that in the village, that woman has been seen with more respect. More girls are seeing her as a role model, and parents are allowing their kids to use the internet because they see this woman being independent, being the go-to person for everyone in the village to access government schemes and fill in forms, as well as women have been able to use their internet access to train themselves and create new entrepreneurial ventures for themselves, and therefore economically empower themselves. So this is a moment where we invest in digital literacy for women on ground, so as to take advantage of the point of time we're at, so that their leadership can be taken online. We also need to definitely encourage and talk about more online safe spaces and do a gender analysis, have more investment in these kind of safe spaces that exist, coupled with new laws and policies that specifically speak to safety of women online. And another long-term solution is definitely to invest more in women and girls in their STEM training, which is engineering, math, and have them be more leaders in the technological revolution in space. Thank you very much.
Thank you, ma'am. Now I'd like to introduce Ms. Aditi Arora. She is the country manager for India for Girl Up. She has previously worked on projects related to gender, health, and child protection, including working for women in landmine-affected countries of DRC and Afghanistan. Good afternoon, ma'am.
Hi, good afternoon. Can you hear me?
Yes, perfect.
Great. Thank you so much, Sequin and Janaki Devi Memorial College. And let me just say, it's such an honor to be sharing this space with such accomplished women. Also, again, I'm not a researcher, nor in academia. But I have been working in the sector for some time, and I'll fall back on that experience while talking about, so the question that was given to me was, the online space has been a potentially empowering tool, but misogyny and gender-based violence seems to have amplified. What kind of structures can be put in place for women and girls to negotiate this space successfully? I would like to start with a question. How many times have you, Dia or Anvita or anyone hearing us right now have had to think at least 2 to 3 times and then check in with your best friend to see if that photograph is decent and not too OTT? How many times have you stopped yourself from calling out bigoted, racist casteist, sexist content on IG or on FB? How many times have you stopped yourself from posting your political opinions? I have, and I have done so on numerous occasions, and I'm sure a lot of you here have done the same. So why are we doing that? Why are we policing and silencing ourselves and other women? Because whenever we speak out, talk about issues that are pressing in the country, when we question the status quo or denounce what the state is doing, we risk backlash from the internet, attacking not just us, but also our families, our relationships, sometimes even insulting how we look. Now, don't get me wrong, the online space has provided women with a very, very powerful platform to share their thoughts, their concerns, their ideas, have their voices heard. And this has supported and facilitated activism for gender equality. Now, of course, Nikita mentioned this. A key example is the hashtag #MeToo movement and the hashtag Time's Up movement. So the internet has increased the visibility of feminism and has enabled activism on a very large scale. But the internet has also increased the capacity for and the incidence of abuse and negative behaviors and attitude towards women. Hostile, anonymous, and misogynistic cultures are facilitated through online spaces and content, putting women at risk of harassment and abuse whenever they use the internet. So a UNESCO report actually stated that close to 73% of women have already been exposed to or have experienced some form of online violence. When we say online violence, it really includes a diversity of tactics and malicious behaviors, ranging from sharing embarrassing or cruel content about someone to impersonation to doxing, could be stalking, electronic surveillance, non-consensual use of photography, and violent threats. So the online harassment of women, sometimes called cyber sexism or cyber misogyny, is specifically gendered abuse targeted at women and girls online. And it incorporates sexism as well as racism, religious prejudice, homophobia, and transphobia. Now, what is the purpose of harassment? It really varies with every incident, but usually includes wanting to embarrass, humiliate, scare, threaten, silence, or extort. Now, women's experiences of violence also vary. Women and girls who experience other forms of systemic, social, political, and economic discrimination and disadvantage may also experience increased frequency and severity of violence due to sexism, intersecting with different aspects of their identity. And that could be your caste, that could be your age, your race, your sexuality. Now, as the internet becomes an increasingly important part of human existence, especially during these times when everything else is shut down, schools are shut down, colleges are off, offices are off, internet is the lifeline. And it's also a very critical space for marginalized populations to make their voices heard. A woman's inability to feel safe online is an impediment to her freedom, as well as her basic human rights, something that was pointed out earlier by the panelists. Yet the problem of online violence and harassment is often overlooked when we discuss violence against women. Violence against women, offline and online, must be acknowledged as a manifestation of systemic marginalization of women throughout society. Now, we need to address online violence because, again, it limits our right to free and full participation, our freedom of expression, our right to safety and to privacy. Now, just because it's in the virtual realm doesn't make it any less real. In fact, there is also an economic cost to online harassment and cyber hate, which a lot of people don't talk about. There's a study where it said that cyber hate had cost Australians an estimated 3.7 billion in health costs and in lost income. So now, how do we address all of this? Firstly is to acknowledge that technology by itself, in and of itself, is really not empowering. It must be interlinked with broader policy interventions across social sectors. Um, and also something that Nikita also pointed out, it's very important that women and girls engage with internet at all levels, which would mean from the use to access to creation to development to the imagination of what it should and can be. Because badly created and designed artificial intelligence systems repeat and exacerbate discrimination. Second is sensitization. It's very important that preventing cyber violence against women can happen through training. It should happen through learning, through campaigning, um, and community development to promote changes in social attitudes and behavior. There needs to be a society-wide advocacy for positive representation of women in media, including advertising online. Second is safeguards. Maintaining a responsible internet infrastructure through technical solutions is very, very important. And social media companies need to take proactive steps to ensure that their space does not enable these acts, because tech industries and companies are really not neutral actors. The third thing is sanctions. We need to develop and uphold laws, regulations, and governance systems to deter perpetrators from committing these acts. Of course, we do have cyber laws, but do we really have the political will to implement it? That rarely happens. And governments need to include online violence against women as a part of their plan to end violence against women as a whole, and really see this as a larger barrier for women and girls in exercising their full range of human rights. I say this because 1 in 5 female internet users live in a country where harassment and where abuse of women online is extremely unlikely to be punished. In many countries, much like in India, women are reluctant to report their victimization for fear of social repercussions. In fact, I also feel a lot of women don't sort of realize it, because a lot of us be like, oh, forget it, ignore these comments, it doesn't matter. So I think that is very important. And then addressing online violence definitely requires collective efforts from individuals, from NGOs, from corporations, and from governments. Lastly, I'd like to say that we really cannot separate online and offline violence, and we must all demand for safer internet for everyone, not just women, but also for children and the youth and trans people, and so that everybody can make their voices heard, free from violence. And I'm done. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am, for your valuable points. I'd now like to hand this over for the question and answer session to Janvi Rudra. For all participants, please go ahead and ask your questions in the Zoom box, and we'll be filtering through all of them and getting your questions answered. Janvi, can you unmute yourself, please?
Okay, yeah, can you hear me? Yeah, sorry. Okay, so I'll be asking questions in the order of the panelists. So first question is for Professor Ankita. You had spoken about epistemic violence and especially the role that plays in the family as well as biopower. So my question for you is, what role does language play in epistemic violence when we talk about the negotiation of rights? Because the family as an institution, it has not traditionally been a space where you have the language of rights and justice and freedom. Does the institution allow for this type of justice? And yeah, just generally, how would you negotiate rights? And what role does language play when it comes to the family?
Right. So particularly, I'm going to draw on sort of Boudhia's example of cultural capital over here, where education allows you to access to education. The right to education is extremely important to allow you access to a language that can engage you in this discourse itself. Cultural capital helps you negotiate those boundaries of social mobility better. Um, so women having the right to education and accessing quality education is what starts the discourse within the linguistic space. To have these changes happening within the private and the public domain to a certain extent. The second thing is that when people have talked of technologies, and particularly, I think Nikita and I forgot the last. I'm sorry, Amrita, I think if I'm not mistaken, spoke about women's access to technological spaces as well. There is a hierarchy of languages that can access certain rights. So the vernacular is always, unfortunately, underprivileged within that space, where how you express yourself, whether it's people ridiculing other people for making TikTok videos, there is a generational gap in terms of access to information as well. um, uh, that is something that does not resolve itself very quickly. Neither does access to rights in the public space for that matter. Something as simple as a train journey will tell you about who can fight better for their right by speaking, by changing the discourse in the language, by speaking English versus speaking Hindi. In a public space can disallow you from having certain rights and can allow you from having access to public support to carry forward your um, right to that space as well. So negotiating this also means dismantling to a large extent our inherent biases about who is more important in the rights discourse and who is less important in the rights discourse. So yeah. Janvi, you have to unmute yourself.
Okay, yeah, sorry. Yeah, thank you so much for that answer. That was really insightful. The next question I have is for Kalpana ma'am. You had mentioned that the NCW had started a helpline, and you were talking about the statistics about, like, with respect to that helpline. I just had a question about how effective are these mechanisms in dealing with, like, domestic violence, especially. So the government initiatives like helplines and etc. And also, I had a larger question about the role of NGOs in dealing with domestic violence, especially during the lockdown. What is the role that an NGO plays when it comes to a long-term solution? Because a lot of people also do believe that the burden ultimately should be on the state itself, and that NGOs, while they are effective, are ultimately a short-term solution. So yeah.
Hi, thank you. The NCW started, I think, end of March. They started a new helpline. So they already have a helpline, right? So the NCW has a helpline, as many state commissions, as well as the police number 181 1091 all. But they, because of the increase in phone calls they were getting, they put up a WhatsApp number to say that maybe a woman can just send a WhatsApp. It might be easier than to call and to give a landline or something like that. So I think that was the intention of the NCW helpline. And they have, see, it's mixed. There have been increase in some kind of reporting, but in some instances, it hasn't increased, but because of all the reasons that I also suggested. Now, the role of NGOs is, see, it's violence against women is there are many different actors in this, right? There's the family, there is other institutions, right? So there is, if it's in the workplace, it's also the employer. If it's in a university setting, it's also the university, and then it's so there are many players. There's the police, there is state helplines, and then there is other actors such as NGOs. Now, what NGOs can do is that they can advise, they can do some counseling, they can provide them. See, what happens for an average woman, you don't know who to reach out to, right? You don't know. Many women are scared to call the police directly. Do you go to a hospital? Should I call the helpline? So I think an NGO can play the role of saying, we will help you get justice, whatever the justice you want. So if what you want is to leave your home, we will help you find this thing. Obviously, I can't put you up, right? But if there's a state shelter, if there's some good place, NGOs can provide that access. Secondly, if the woman needs legal recourse, if she needs legal recourse, the NGO can either provide access to pro bono lawyers, the legal service authority, or if you want to go to the police, some women are afraid to go to the police on their own. So it can be someone that goes along with them. So you're absolutely right. No private system can replace what the state must do. But we can hold the state accountable, and we can hold the hand of the woman while she navigates that extremely complex, hostile, patriarchal system to help her get some justice. And
Yeah, thank you so much for that answer. I think you're right that a lot of times even the state mechanisms end up being inherently patriarchal. So women can't look to the state a lot of the times. Okay, my next question is for Professor Shilpa. So you had talked about how a lot of times when it comes to the mobility of women in public spaces, a lot of times safety, the idea of safety is something that holds them back. I wanted to ask you about this in the context of an online space in terms of how democratic it is, because a lot of dissent has shifted online. And so I just wanted to ask how democratic it is, not only in terms of access, in terms of who gets to protest, but also in terms of, like, we all know that online certain bodies are targeted, they are doxxed. For example, in the case of CA protests, a lot of Instagrams were taken down, people are specifically like targeted and doxxed. So yeah, I just wanted to ask how democratic is that space already, and what are things we can do to make it more democratic?
Thanks, Janvi. Am I audible?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks for that question. We really have to think about the online very much in the same way as we look at the streets. Because women are being told about the online exactly what they are being told about the streets. And if you heard what Nikita and Aditi were saying about the online space, and in fact Aditi began with this series of questions about how women are constantly told to be very, very careful about what they post online. And there's a very exciting essay that some of the students might want to look at. It's by two scholars called Wendy Chun and Sarah Friedland. It's called Habits of Leaking. And they argue, they say that women are told this idea that once it's there to stay. So women are told anything you put out there is never going to leave the internet. And so you need to be careful. And it's really a parallel to what women are told about the streets, right? We're told don't go out, stay inside because it's safe. And we really need to think about questions of risk and loitering in relation to the online space as well. What does it mean if we claim that online space? I mean, all of these risks exist. They exist on the streets as much as they exist online. But these are also places, the streets as much as the online space are also spaces of pleasure where women want to hang out. And a lot of women who, as some of the speakers pointed out, who cannot whose families restrict them from going out, right? At least sometimes are able to access the online via their phones, where of course, if it's found that they are talking to boys, sometimes their phones are taken away, but quite often they do have access to loiter online in a way that they might not have access to loiter on the streets. So of course there are risks out there, but I would argue that the online is a space. It's also a space that has allowed people to mount all kinds of activism. There is a very, very exciting body of activism out there, the Dalit activism around Black Lives Matter, trans activism, that has allowed people, in a sense, the capacity to find others like them. And so even as we think about questions of safety online, I feel that we do need to think about the online as a space that we inhabit as citizens, as users of the online, in ways that are sort of more enabling.
Yeah, thank you so much. My next question is for Santa ma'am. So my question was about the representation of trans voices in the public sphere. So my question has two parts. So one type of representation is structural, right, in terms of reservations, in terms of job opportunities, etc. And the other type of representation that I'm talking about is the representation of trans voices in feminist discourse. So online conversations and webinars like this one. So my question is basically, when it comes to representation and these voices being heard, what are ways that corporations, individuals, governments, what are ways that these type of representation can exist in a meaningful way, so it does not end up being tokenistic, where it is not just you are hiring one person who is trans as a diversity hire, and then you're putting them into a space which is only cisgender individuals, and ultimately that individual is not uplifted because they have been put into an environment that is really homogenous. So yeah, that's my question.
Janvi, I think Santaram is having some technical issues. We'll try and get her back.
Okay, cool. I can ask, then I can just move on to Nikita ma'am for now. So my question to you was, you had talked about how we need to invest more generally in STEM, and especially like learning for younger women so that they can get into the field. What are different ways in which, as a community, as students, how can youth engagement play a role in making spaces more accessible? And especially in terms of younger women and students, in terms of just having more representation of women in the field of technology as a whole.
I think what's great is that younger women from urban areas are already, I don't mean to generalize, there are obviously, different sorts of intersectionalities that play into that, but there are more and more young women from urban areas who are present in online spaces. And I think just the recognition of the fact that this is not currently representative of our entire, of women in India, I think we have a sort of a responsibility to raise that up as much as we can, because we do have access to this space. Like, for example, with the She Creates Change platform and the campaign, the idea is to share your experiences, talk more about the barriers that you have faced in your environment and your access to the internet, to build a narrative for a long-term sustained investment into women in digital technologies. So I think it is great to educate ourselves about what the disparity is, and it's great to have an awareness of it and also speak more about it. But that's my limited perspective, and I think that there's a lot more that we need to advocate for, and that it's a good question to think about. What more can we do? I would put that question back to you as young people, all of you, to think about, now that we know that it's such an unequal space, what is one individual action that you could potentially take after this talk to ensure that we have more women online?
Yeah, thank you very much. My question now is for Aditi ma'am. And I just had a question about, so we've spoken a lot about cyber crimes and cyber harassment, and how the government also needs to look at it as legitimate as offline crimes against women and harassment and violence against women. My question was that in a lot of these cases, the victims of these victims of violence or victims of these crimes, they do not feel like the state has adequately justice has not been served by the state, basically. So what does justice look like for these types of crimes? And especially given that, like, a lot of times the state is not able to deliver justice, so as a community, what can we do to make sure that justice is served and that it is a safe space for women?
Am I audible now?
Yeah, you're audible.
Yeah, your question has at least 3 parts to it. First is, what does justice look like to the victim of cyber hate? To be very honest, and I think it's called, I'm not sure, please correct me if I'm wrong. I think the term is called retributive justice, right? You can't have one understanding of justice. So, for example,
if the candidate has not given the percentage, then in that case,
can I?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so for example, in the Nirbhaya case, right? For me personally, death penalty was not really justice. For me, that was my personal opinion. But for Nirbhaya's mother, if that was justice to her, then I will not deny her that right. So justice looks very different for different people. It really depends, right? For me, if I was a victim of cyber hate, I would definitely want that person, I would report that person and not want him or her to continue doing this to other people. But for someone else, it could look completely different. right? So justice has different definitions and meanings for depending on your context, right? That was the first thing. The second question, the second part of your question was, what was it? What can the state do?
Yeah, what can the state do, and what as a community, if the state is not able to deliver justice, what can we do to make it a safer space?
So, you know, as I said, it's very important to sensitize everybody. As a community, we need to start really advocating for a really positive representation of women online. Even in online advertising, when you see these Dorito chips ads, or if you see, you know, I'm not going to name it, but a lot of deodorant ads, there's so much objectification of women, right? We have to start from that. I think it's very important to create a safe space only when you start looking at women and not as objects. And I know Instagram last year, they have made a lot of changes in their community user policy. Now sensitive images are blurred. After Jamila Jamil's advocacy, now young people are not able to see certain things related to slimming teas or you know, these other things that will promote bulimia or anorexia or other eating disorders. So everybody has to advocate and make sure that Instagram and Facebook and other tech industries are responsible. This is what we can do as individuals. Does that answer your question?
That makes, yeah, thank you so much. Unfortunately, I don't think Santa ma'am will be joining us again. Really wish you could have been here to answer the question, but I'll just be handing over the mic to Kutsia, who's going to deliver the vote of thanks.
Kutsia, we can't hear you. You're still not audible. Maybe connect with your audio.
So, yeah.
Kutsia, we can't hear you. Ma'am, while we try to connect with Kutsia, could you like to share your words?
Yes, on behalf of Janki Devi Memorial College, especially the Department of HDFE and Women's Developmental Center, I would like to thank Sequin. Special thanks to Laura Prabhu and Naseem Khan, who have been constantly engaging with our students. And Laura, thank you so much for giving our students an opportunity to do internship. And last year also, the students were very happy. They came back with a lot of learning. And I must thank Naseem because she has been very patient with all our students. And of course, all the panelists of 23rd and today's panelists. Kalpana, special thanks to you. And last but not the least, I must thank our principal, Dr. Swati Pal, who has always given us space to do these kind of webinars and encourage our students to participate. So thank you very much, Dr. Swati Pal, and of course, Surinder ji for giving us technical support. So thank you, Sequin. So we hope that you will again allow our students to do their internship with you. Thank you so much. So that's fine. I think there's some problem with the, yeah. Would you like to say something?
Yes, yeah. I'm not sure if Kutsia is able to get on, but I really want to take the time out to thank each of the panelists for sharing their valuable time with us. It's really been an amazing journey. It's genuinely been a labor of love. All of us have collaborated from the spaces of our own home. And the fact that all of us were able to do this in the period of lockdown has really been nice. If Kutsia can unmute and share her vote of thanks, I think she curated.
I think there's some technical problem. Anyway, thank you so much. So we will be in touch. Thank you. Thank you, Kalpana. Thank you, Swati, Dr. Swati Pal.
Thank you, everybody. And bravo to all the students from across the country. I think you're doing a fantastic job. Perhaps we need to learn from you. Thank you.
For all the participants, we shared.
Yeah.
the feedback.
Kalpana, can, yeah, all the participants, if you can then share their, yeah.
Thank you very much to all of you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Nice to see some of you. Kalpana, great to see you.
I know, same here.